What's good, Modern Retro Show family? It's Teacher Eddie back with another history reaction. So I apologize for yesterday. We didn't put out any new videos, but for those who did see our tribute to James R., had been with us since the beginning, a year ago when we started Modern Retro Show. And he unfortunately passed away. And after the tribute video, really just broken down, couldn't do anything. But this is going to be cathartic for me, so to speak, because I love history, I love teaching, and creation always brings out the best in me. So today we're going to be talking about the Articles of Confederation, my first reaction to extra credits, which you guys have been asking for. So the Articles of Confederation, a very interesting subject. I always present it whenever I teach the Articles of Confederation as basically the first draft of the Constitution. So 1786, the colonists win their independence, they defeat the British, and then they're like, hey, we got to come up with some kind of government, I guess, right? We got to write some laws down, like what's this whole America thing going to be about? So in 1786, they come up with the Articles of Confederation, which, of course, is going to pose a lot of problems, which will be exacerbated by Shea's rebellion, which I assume maybe they'll get into. If not, I will supplement it, as I always do in the videos. And in 1789, they come back to amend. So Continental Congress comes back, and the mission of the meeting is to amend the Articles of Confederation to make them stronger, especially after Shea's rebellion. But they end up drafting what becomes the United States Constitution instead. So this is going to be very interesting. So let's get into it.
The United States Constitution created a republic that has lasted for well over 200 years, but it was not the first national government of the United States of America. That distinction goes to the short-lived Articles of Confederation, without which the Constitution as it exists today might never have been formed. The British Parliament had just about had it with their American colonists. First, they ran up enormous debts fighting the French, which, respectable enough, I guess, but they now refused to pay the taxes that would fund it, and they even had the gall to argue that Parliament had no right to issue taxes to them at all. And now some radicals in Boston had ruined an entire shipment of taxable goods in a shocking disregard for tea. Parliament weighed their options and decided to take a risk. They would punish Boston and the entire colony of Massachusetts, making an example of them to warn other colonies against taking similar rebel actions.
Yeah, so after the French-Indian War, Britain is like, man, we really spent a lot on that. And we fought, mainly, of course, to protect the colonies. So the colonies should chip in, right? So they weren't really asking anything out of the ordinary from the colonies at the time. And the colonists themselves, while they were looking for representation, they said, look, if you're going to tax us, we should have a say in our government, right? But their government, George Washington, up until the very end, considered himself an Englishman. He wanted nothing more than to be an Englishman. So when we talk about a say in the government, not just in running local governments in the colonies, which they were already doing, but having a seat in the Parliament in England, what they considered their mother country. So the founding fathers, to whom we credit for creating this new nation, that wasn't their goal in the beginning. Their goal was only to have a voice, so to speak. But they really wanted to continue being a part of the English Empire. They weren't really looking to secede, so to speak, and create this whole new country. But you could really see it from the English perspective. Whenever I teach this, I always try to, bring it up as America, well, the colonies at the time, are basically like those petulant teenagers, right? Them hormones are running. They feel like they're adults, and they're tired of sitting at the kiddie table. They want to sit at that big boy table now, right? And so what do? They do what most teenagers do. They rebel.
They shut down Boston Harbor and revoked the Massachusetts colony's right to govern itself. But there was a problem with Parliament's carefully considered, surgically precise retaliation. It sucked. After all, there were still many Americans who were loyal to the crown. Their loyalty sprang not from a fear of punishment, but from a genuine and even patriotic belief that the British government was the best government on earth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So exactly what I was trying to say. They love John Adams, Washington, Hamilton, Madison. Maybe Jefferson wasn't a huge fan, but still not enough to want to break ties with England.
Because it guaranteed representation and rights and all these wonderful things that Parliament had just deemed necessary to strip away. But the radicals and the loyalists were united in one belief, that a display of American unity would help Parliament and King George III reconsider the justice of these acts and repeal them. Delegates from the colonies convened at a Continental Congress in 1774 to draft a nice, thoughtful letter explaining their objections and asking Parliament to kindly repeal these laws. By the end of the week, though, what had been originally intended as a gentle letter of friendship had transformed into an open rebuke and a vow to embargo British goods. Many of the delegates cheered this display of resolve. One, shouting to be heard above the cheers, warned that this act would be a declaration of war. Nobody listened. They were too busy congratulating themselves on the inevitable capitulation of Great Britain. But just in case, they did agree to reconvene in half a year if Parliament didn't meet their demands. Half a year later, shots had been fired, and the American Revolutionary War was underway. So the Continental Congress met again. Despite everything that had happened, those who had been loyal to the crown still held out hope for peace. They decided to write another letter, because that first one had just worked so well, but this time they would write directly to the king, and promise that they were still loyal and totally understood that his bad ministers had led him astray. King George refused to even read this letter, and declared all the colonies to be in open rebellion. So 0 for 2 on the letter thing. It didn't help that at the same time Congress had been drafting this petition for peace, they had also mustered a continental army, appointed a general by the name of George Washington, and begun to organize armed resistance. Many loyalists saw this as a necessary act of self-defense. Radicals saw it as the first step toward American independence. The idea of independence had begun to gain popularity, but the delegates of the Continental Congress could not act on it. Not only did many still hope to reconcile with Great Britain, but they also had to answer to the governments in their home colonies, and their governments said, absolutely not. Nope, do not even think about declaring.
Yeah, a lot of people think it was, especially today when people quote the founding fathers or the creation of America or these American ideals, they all think that the founding fathers are this one cohesive unit of people who agreed upon all these, wonderful ideas of independence and rights and everything else. But they were literally a disjointed band of people, who bickered with each other, obviously drank a lot, got into constant arguments over what they should be doing, how they should be doing it. And the other issue is, a lot of people think that these things happen so quickly, right? It begins in 1774 and it goes on for basically 20 plus years. We go through the Declaration of Independence, we go through a Civil War, then we go through, a Revolutionary War, and then we actually have kind of a Civil War. There are a whole bunch of rebellions that start popping up. Shea's Rebellion, which was a rebellion led by, the man's name was Shea, and the rebellion was all the people who fought in the Revolutionary War were still waiting to be paid. This is something we see happen throughout history. Even when we did recently a video about the 1920s, the plot to steal the White House, right? If you haven't checked that out, check out my video on the business plot. There were so many what they called bonus army soldiers in the Hoovervilles who were waiting to be paid for World War I into the late, 1920s, even into the 1930s. So we see these rebellions pop up. So it wasn't an instantaneous thing. It wasn't a cohesive thing. Even when they're creating the government, even when they're finalizing and creating the Constitution, there's a whole battle, right? The Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, we get these amazing writings under pseudonyms, but we know who wrote what, right? And we get into their whole mindset of what they're thinking, why they're thinking it, and how then eventually they amend it and come to a compromise, which creates the Bill of Rights. So it wasn't this cohesive unit or band of brothers, so to speak.
Independence. Once again, the time was ripe here for a thoughtful, strategic intervention by British Parliament, and once again they did not miss the opportunity. They announced a blockade of all 13 colonies and effectively expelled them from the empire. The last hope for reconciliation was snuffed out.
Yeah.
The colonies stopped being colonies and instead became self-governing states. They threw out their old systems of government and the loyalists who ran them and wrote new state constitutions. Their delegates at the Continental Congress received new instructions. Please, yes, do declare independence now. Heck, Rhode Island got so excited it declared itself an independent nation before anybody else could. Swept up in the enthusiasm for state building, in the summer of 1776, the Continental Congress resolved to declare independence, seek foreign allies, and write a constitution. Ideas for a constitution that brought the colonies together in an alliance had been floating around for decades, but
Yeah, this is one point of confusion sometimes for people. The Declaration of Independence did not set out. A lot of people think the Declaration sets out and forms the new government. But you have to remember, a lot of the founding fathers, including, of course, Jefferson and Adams, because Jefferson doesn't write the Declaration by himself. He gets a lot of input from Adams as well as Franklin. But, of course, he is the main author, so to speak. So they were lawyers. So the Declaration of Independence actually sets out a list of charges against the King of England, right? So it's like they're trying a court case. So as lawyers, they actually write out there were dozens of different charges that they were petitioning against the king in this act. So the Declaration of Independence, the preamble to it about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and, you know, all men are created equal, is kind of like an opening argument, so to speak, in a court case. But then the rest of the document is just a list of charges, is what it was. It wasn't the formation or ideology of, you know, what the government was going to be or what the colonies would be.
The most influential model had come from Benjamin Franklin, a philosopher, statesman, and hobby kite enthusiast. Franklin had become fascinated by the Haudenosaunee, Native American peoples who had formed a confederacy of 6 nations. Their leader saw an echo of his own people's divided past in the British colonies and urged them to form a confederacy of their own. This idea had sparked Franklin's immense curiosity. He embarked on a study of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, European models of government, and even colonial alliances from the early days of settlement. In 1754, he had met with delegates from other colonies and laid out his Plan of Union, which synthesized elements of the governments that he'd studied into a uniquely American vision. The delegates enthusiastically adopted it. They brought it home to their governments, and their governments just as enthusiastically threw it out. The colonies had wanted to be able to determine their own fates, at least as far as Parliament would let them. Franklin's plan asked them to give up some of their political power to a central legislature, which would control their foreign affairs, creating yet another unwanted layer of supervision to get in their way. No thank you. But Franklin continued working.
Which eventually, it's really the basis for what eventually would become our checks and balances system. So Franklin had an immense foresight. And that's one of the main reasons why he's on that $100 bill, right? It's all about the Benjamins, baby.
On this plan. When he joined the Second Continental Congress in 1775, he revised it and presented it as a plan for how this multi-state Congress should be organized. They had basically been winging it for the last year, coasting off of popular approval and the indulgence of the colonies, but they had no official grant of authority. Franklin hoped to fix that, but he had acted just a bit too early. The independence movement needed about another year to warm up to the idea of a constitution, so his proposal was pushed aside again. Okay, so now fast forward back to where we were in 1776. At last, the pendulum is swinging in favor of a constitution to spell out the rights and responsibilities of the Continental Congress. An unlikely man takes the helm. John Dickinson, who has been a vocal loyalist, staunchly opposed to both independence and revolution. Yet he has also led the way for both of them. His newspaper articles about the need to resist British taxation through non-violent boycotts had shaped the early stages of colonial resistance, and since then he's
Yeah, Dickinson also was a huge influence on Jefferson. And definitely, if you've never read it, there were a whole series of papers out of Pennsylvania at the time, and actually Jefferson pens an early paper as well, because Jefferson is trying to get into elite status at the time in the 1760s, in the 1770s. So Dickinson has a huge influence on Jefferson as well.
authored so many documents on behalf of the Congress that he'll later be known as the penman of the Revolution. Dickinson fears that the states aren't yet ready to govern themselves without the protections of British law. Seeing many of his fellow delegates argue for independence before they even have a constitution only makes him more convinced that they haven't thought through what independence requires.
Exactly.
So he volunteers to lead the committee to draft a constitution and get things started right. He blows the dust off of Benjamin Franklin's plan and takes the name from the top of the page, Articles of Confederation. But this new country needs a better name than the United Colonies of North America. They're not colonies anymore, they're states. How about the United States of America? Over the next few weeks, Dickinson leads the creation of a new constitution and updates Franklin's work with his own ideas. He replaces the backbone of British law with a central legislature that has authority over the states. He guarantees civil rights at the national level and restricts foreign policy decisions to his new Confederation Congress.
And that was one of the big problems with the Articles of Confederation.
He's almost ready to submit his final draft when the moment he feared so much arrives. The Declaration of Independence is ready to go, and Congress must vote on whether or not to sign it. Dickinson does his best to block the vote, arguing that the states must ratify a constitution first. How can they declare independence when they don't even have a national government? The other delegates scoff at this idea. They don't need a national government. The states have been doing just fine on their own. Just as Franklin found 20 years earlier, the states still do not want to give up their power to...
And that was a huge hurdle. The states really did not want a central government. The states wanted to be states, right? Because it's a unique idea to American government that we are these united states, right? It would be like if, Germany and Italy and Spain, all got together and said, hey, we're going to become, this one country instead of independent states. So, it was a huge hurdle to get over to convince them. They just wanted a kind of loose affiliation, so to speak, kind of like Europe. Now, they're their own governments, they're their own states, so to speak. But, they have a loose, confederation, so to speak. And that's what a lot of Americans wanted at the time. And even throughout, 1786 and on, until the Constitution is finally ratified, that's really what a lot of people wanted. Could you imagine having to leave, if you go from New York to New Jersey? You would have to basically have, documents and papers to enter the state because you're entering, a different state that's not affiliated with New York. You would have to change currencies. I mean, it would be absolutely insane.
To a central legislature. After all, the whole point of this revolution was to get rid of British Parliament. Why would they rush to put some other power in its place? The vote for independence goes to the floor. Everybody except Dickinson votes yes. He can't vote yes in good conscience, and he won't vote no to undermine the unanimous support from the other delegates. Instead, he resigns from Congress. His reputation in...
And I will say, there were a lot of men of this era who were absolutely willing to sacrifice themselves for a greater ideal. No man symbolized that more than Washington. Washington was imperfect, of course, as all men are. But he really was the right man at the right place for the right jobs, whether it was being, of course, the general of the army or His Excellency George Washington and eventually the President of the United States. who then creates all the precedents that presidents will follow for centuries, of course, because they do create the longest surviving constitution known to human history. And it is because of people like Washington and Dickinson and many others that this experiment survives as long as it does, because it was just a perfect storm of right place, right time, right people.
Ruins, and he goes to serve in the war. Without Dickinson to defend it, the Articles of Confederation he drafted gets torn to pieces. The strong central legislature he proposed gets demoted to an advisory board. Civil rights protections disappear. This Congress will have no power over the states and has to trust them to fund it voluntarily. Congress does get to keep the power to make foreign treaties, but it'll have no way to enforce them. It is this version of the Articles of Confederation, so different than what Dickinson wrote over a year ago, that finally gets sent to the states for ratification.
Yeah, so the problem with the Articles of Confederation were many. So the Articles of Confederation, again, they last until 1789, right? So the Continental Congress gets back together and they say, look, this Articles of Confederation's crap just ain't working, especially after Shea's rebellion, which proved two things, two vital points. Shea's rebellion, again, is a rebellion of soldiers from the Revolutionary War who still hadn't been paid. And the Articles of Confederation do not let the central government tax its people, right? Because they're still dealing with the inner hurts of Parliament wanting to tax them in the first place. So the two issues were that the government couldn't tax people to collect money to pay the soldiers. And the second issue was they couldn't raise money or raise an army. So they weren't allowed to raise an army. So they couldn't raise an army to put down the rebellion. So they couldn't solve the rebellion and they couldn't stop the rebellion. So they knew they needed a stronger central government, right? Because, some of the issues were, again, the government couldn't tax the citizens directly. It could only basically ask the states to contribute money. Again, this loose confederation of different states. So it's kind of like when you go to the museum and they say, there's no fee to come into the museum, but, a donation is whatever you want to put in. So a state could easily say, like, here's $1. Another state could say, here's $10,000. But, it is what it is. The government couldn't raise an army, right? So again, that was the issue that Shea's rebellion really exposes. There was no executive branch, right? So there was no president. There was no role of a president. There was no main figure, as Truman would later coin, the buck stops here, right? Even though the early form of president is not eventually what it becomes. It's something that gets molded, time over time. And of course, also doesn't have a judicial branch, right? So there's no Supreme Court that we have now. So, and if you wanted to pass laws, it required the approval of all the states. So there were a lot of problems with the Articles of Confederation, which then get solved with the Constitution, of course. And again, there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of bickering. And we do have, Monroe and Madison to really thank for the Constitution. They're really the authors of the Constitution. Usually Madison gets a lot of the credit, but Monroe really did put forth a lot of effort into the creation of the Constitution. And then, of course, with the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, we get the creation of the original 10 Bill of Rights. Because, they argued that, yeah, but these are kind of like givens. I mean, we don't really have to write them down. But then the other side said, well, yeah, but they may be givens to us, but who knows what's going to happen in the future, right? So the right to, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the rights to, not self-incriminate and everything else. And then, of course, the 10th Amendment stating that any powers not herefore mentioned basically go to the states, right? So it's a brilliant document. Again, the longest surviving constitution in human history. So they obviously got a lot done right. So that was very fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please check out another video. Check out a playlist. Support the channel. Support your boys. Speaking of support, of course, shouting out the Patreons. Our brother, rest in peace, James R. Spacey Doodle, Elena G, Ulrike, Clement, Vajandra, Alan, Alex, Baba Mama, Aaron Shepard, Big J Jobina, Dallas Seeger, Freeman Stephenson, and Moody Kakari. I've been Teacher Eddie, and I'll see you next time.